All right, welcome everyone. I'm Rick Anderson, one of the product engineers for the utility network team. Can everybody hear me back there? Is that coming through okay? All right, so this session, hopefully it's what you're here for, is to talk about network diagrams with the utility network. Just real quick, show of hands, who in here used the ArcGIS schematics extension? Okay, quite a few hands there. All right, so you probably already know, but it's worth repeating for those that don't. Network diagrams is the new version of ArcGIS schematics. The schematics was an extension that worked in the geometric network days. Network diagrams is now what we've got in the utility network. Quite a few differences. I'll point out a few along the way. The biggest one right off the beginning is network diagrams are now fully embedded inside of the utility network. There's no more extension. So when you have a utility network, you automatically have network diagram capabilities. So let's go ahead and jump in. Just real quick, just to kind of set a level playing field here, some terminology. What is a diagram? I mean, hopefully you guys know, since that's what you're here for, but a diagram really is the final end product. A lot of people think about it like a CAD drawing, right? It's things, I set it up there, right? Engineering type folks really love diagrams. Right? They don't like to see the geographic view so much. They want a very simplified schematic or diagrammatic view of their data. So diagrams usually have diagram layouts applied. They're not necessarily geo-referenced anymore. They're not geo-schematic. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes they're not. And diagrams are also based on diagram templates. So what is a diagram layout? A layout is what we consider a layout algorithm. It's a different way to visualize the layout of those features. So sometimes they're trees, sometimes we just square edges, various different diagrammatic ways of looking at data. What is a diagram template? The diagram template is the actual configuration. Think of it as a type of diagram. So a lot of times, say in electric, they want a, let's say it's a switching diagram. Okay, well what does that mean? That's a type of diagram where I only want to see certain types of features and I want it laid out a specific way. Or often we hear single line diagram. That's a common one out in the utility type of industry. What does a single line diagram mean? Actually, if you could give me a 100% definition, I'd pay you for that, because every customer you talk to, that's a little different. But just know we build a framework that allows you to configure those diagram templates to meet those customer needs. So who are those customers? Really, for this small presentation, we'll talk about two of them, the end user and the administrator. So the end user is the person that's generating these diagrams, right? Their job is really just to select some geographic data, to generate a new diagram, to optionally apply a layout algorithm to that diagram, to maybe do some white space management on that diagram, clean it up a little bit, and then they decide whether they want to store this diagram or not. I'll show you the store here in a minute, but that is one of the big differences from the old schematics side. In ArcGIS schematics, when you generated a diagram, it was stored permanently from that point on. In the new network diagrams, when you generate, it's just temporary. If you don't tell the system that you want to store that, it's temporary, and we've got processes to just purge those temporary diagrams at a later time. It's a cleaner system. We started seeing lots of very large companies, especially telcos, where we'd go in and look and they'd have 30 to 50,000 diagrams that were generated, but they don't ever maintain. They were just used to understand a portion. They didn't mean to keep them forever, but because they were stored, they were permanently in the system and just bloating the database, right? So we flipped that with this new world. We decided, you know what, we're not gonna permanently store it unless you specifically tell us to store it. It makes it easier to keep that stuff clean. Actually, before we do that, let's just jump in and look at some software. So from the end user perspective, you know, what do? Here's a very simple electric example. This is our Naperville sample. If you guys go out to the solutions page and download the, it's called an asset package, but if you download the solution for electric, this is the data that comes with it. I'm going to zoom in to one of the substations, and we're going to set up a simple little trace here. I'm going to set a starting point on this circuit breaker inside the substation. I'm going to set up a couple of barriers to sort of contain where this thing goes for the purpose of this demo. Let's stop it from running too far. We'll add a couple more barriers in here, just contain this thing to a decent size area. All right, so we've got a small little area, and then I'm just going to run a connected trace on this. For those of you that just were here seeing Tom's demo before, he showed quite a few other subnetwork fancier traces. I do not want to include my barrier features, and I'm just going to run the connected. This will get us 20 features or something. 21 features. So as an end user, now what do I do with those? It's quite simple because, again, the diagrams are embedded in. It's not an extension anymore. You can see up here on my utility network ribbon, there's lots of stuff about the topology and the tracing. But notice there's a whole section for the diagrams built directly into the ribbon experience. So as a user, they drop down the new diagram, and this gives them a list of the diagram templates that are available for them to choose from. So out of the box, when you create a utility network, we provide these three out of the box. They're really just meant as a quick start. Some folks that have never really played with diagrams before, because honestly, the schematic side, it was quite difficult to get that first step in. This alleviates that. The first step's done for you. Just select data and generate a diagram. You're probably not going to want to use these in production. They're very simple. Right? You're going to want to build your own customized diagram templates and delete those, okay? But they're there just to help people get started. See if they're interested in it, see if they want to go farther with the diagram capabilities. So what do? I'm going to pick basic. So whatever was defined inside that basic diagram template is now applied, and we get a new diagram. So the diagram opens up in a new tab. And now you can work with it. So what do you do with one of these things? Well, usually a user is going to apply an algorithm if it's not already done. So I'll show you that. I'm going to set a starting location on this circuit breaker. I'm going to choose one of the diagram layouts. So these are the ones that are defined in the system. You can see I've got trees. I've got ways. If you guys have lots of lines that are very closely spaced in the geographic view, we've got algorithms that just help spread that apart. So diagrammatically, you can see it much clearer without having to go mess with your geographic data. Here, I'm just going to apply a smart tree. Lots of different options that you can do. Like here, I'll start, since this circuit breaker is kind of on the right side, we'll tell the system to go from right to left, and maybe I'll choose to curve the edges. Now we run that, it'll start with that circuit breaker on the far right. It applies a smart tree. It makes nice little curves. That wasn't there before in the old schematics. This is something new we've added. You see these big boxes. These boxes are actually containers. So these are either assemblies or, who knows, they might be, they're most likely assemblies in this particular case. So it just gives you a different way to look at it. Maybe I would rather see this from top to bottom, and instead of those fancy curve things, I want to see squared lines. So we'll switch that over, and very quickly we get a different rendering of this, right? So what else can a user do? Well, you might want to do some white space editing. As these diagrams get bigger and bigger and bigger, sometimes you still need to do white space. We don't have a layout algorithm that might do 100% of what your users have been doing. Oftentimes we'll get somebody that brings us a CAD drawing. CAD drawing was done 100 years ago, manually, somebody deciding what to do, and they say, can you do this? Which algorithm do I use? Probably not going to have one out of the box. It just does what somebody manually did 100 years ago, right? So we have a series of algorithms that hopefully get you pretty close. And then, of course, you can do white space editing to finish it up. So another interesting thing is the editing tools are now the out-of-the-box editing tools. So the same tools you use to edit geographic data are the same tools you use to edit schematic data. For those of you that used ArcGIS schematics before, you know that was a completely different set of tools. It was often quite frustrating for users because they had to train their end users on two different sets of tools to do the same job, right? So we've merged that together with the new utility network. So an example, let's grab the move tool, and maybe I'll move this thing. You'll see something interesting happen because we've got containment going on here. The diagram side is set up to say, hey, if you're contained, if you move that child, the container must automatically resize, so we always see what is contained and what isn't. I'll grab another one and do the same thing just so you can see that box sort of drawing, right? So the diagram side will always do that. Maybe I want to move the whole container itself, so I can grab the container, and now you see all of the child components of the container move in that same edit operation. So anyway, an end user can apply layout algorithms. They can do manual white space editing and play with this diagram until they're satisfied with the look and feel. At this point, you see over in my table of contents, this is still considered a temporary diagram. So this is what we were talking about at the beginning. If I just closed this session, this diagram is not actually being persisted yet into my versioned database. So we can run a purge tool nightly, and it just goes and gets rid of all of this garbage that nobody decided they wanted to store. If I do want to store it, though, up here on the network diagram ribbon, you'll see a store command, opens up a GP tool. We'll call this thing test diagram and run that. And you'll see it here in a second. You'll see it sort of flip around. The name of the tab switched. The TOC itself changed. This has now been moved from temporary non-versioned tables into the versioned database. This is also a big difference. ArcGIS schematics, those diagrams were not versioned. These are now versioned diagrams. So you can keep track of what's happened, edits over time on these diagrams. So how do I then find one of these diagrams? Well, if I close this, I have a command on the utility network ribbon in the diagram section called find. What this has now done was go find any diagram that has a feature in the current geographic extent. So these three diagrams all have features that are displayed on the map at this current moment. You can change options to go farther than that if you want to. But here's test diagram that we just stored. So of course I can open that back up, and it's exactly the way that it was when we stored it. I could continue editing now, doing whatever I want. I could look at other diagrams. Maybe somebody else generated something good for this area already. I don't need to go generate a new diagram. Somebody else already did it. Maybe I can reuse that diagram, right? So this had a little bit more data than the one that we looked at before. It had some curved edges. And I think this Napier small is the original one that we looked at. Yeah, that's the original sort of one that we looked at. So three different views of this diagram, pretty quick, pretty easy to get to. What else did propagation. What else does a user do with the diagram? Well, an interesting thing, and it's much nicer in Pro than it used to be, because Pro has this multi-window capability. So what I can do is put my diagram and my geographic side by side and very quickly jump back and forth. Now on this small screen it doesn't look so great, but just know I can tear off one of these maps. If I've got multiple monitors, I can have one monitor with just my diagram, one with my geographic, and very quickly move back and forth. So what does that look like? Well, let's select something on my diagram, and I click this button that says apply to map, and we've got some scale suppression on here, but if I zoom in a little bit, you can see that it is now zoomed. We can now see that exact feature over on this side. So let's move down, maybe grab this transformer, apply that again, right? It's a nice way to view my data schematically like my engineers want, but now they see something that they're interested in, and it's very quick for them to go find that in the real world, right? Or vice versa, I can select something in the geographic view and have it located automatically over on the diagram view. Yeah, I think that's really the most that I wanted to show you on this side. So, how do I create a diagram template? That's where we step in on the admin user. So, get back into sharing mode. So the admin user, what are the type of things that they do? They create and configure diagram templates for the organization. They also run processes to clean up those temporary diagrams that we no longer need. Now, for those of you that used the schematics extension before, you know you pretty much had to take a training class to learn how to use the configuration tool to create a diagram template. It was tricky. Everything in the utility network and Pro is now inside geoprocessing tools. So you simply just drag and drop tools onto Model Builder, connect everything together, and that's how you now build diagram templates. You don't need to learn another application anymore. So what do you need to think about for diagram template configuration? Remember, it defines a type of diagram. So what exactly are you trying to achieve? Is it a switching diagram? Is it a whatever it means for you to be a one-line diagram? What conceptually are you trying to do? What's the symbology and labeling you want? What are the rules and the layouts? So rules say, what are we going to remove? Because remember, your user's just selecting data on the map. So by default, everything they selected goes on the diagram. But if your diagram wants to simplify it, you as the admin configure this to remove certain things from the data, and we automatically create logical superspans between the next pieces of equipment to simplify the network. And then, of course, the layout. What do we want the final layout to look like? So let's go take a quick look at how that works. First off, to do this, you're going to need to be in a client-server mode. That last map I was using, we were connected to services. The UN is a service-based architecture. Everything goes through the service, except for configuration. When you're configuring a UN, when you're configuring the diagram templates, you're doing that in a client-server connection, not inside of a service connection. So I'm switching over to that map, which forces Pro to have to recreate which workspace that it's looking at. This will take a second. This will take a second, maybe 2 seconds, maybe 10 seconds, maybe more. Well, that's switching. We'll take a quick look over at the toolboxes. So in GP toolboxes, you'll see we have a utility network tools. All the tools for utility network are inside this toolbox. So all the administration tools for the UN, there's a whole section for network diagrams by itself. So we have configuration tools to do all the template configuration. We have layout tools for the end user, you know, all of these different layout algorithm type of things that we looked at. Pro's not very happy with me right now, so this might get interesting. Let's see what happens. I don't think it's going to let me run a tool. Oh, it's coming back. Whew. Almost made me look bad. It's often very much snappier than that, trust me. All right, so I'm going to add a diagram template. What do we need to do? We'll point this to my geodatabase, which in this case is everything's running. I've got server, portal, Postgres, everything's running on this laptop right now. So I'm pointing this to my local Postgres instance, to my utility network, and I'm going to give this thing a name. We'll call it Dev Summit, and we'll run this. So behind the scenes, this is creating the very basic shell for a diagram template. So we could, without doing anything else, already go allow a user to generate a diagram with this. Now remember, those diagram templates showed up in the ribbon. So after I've done this, I do need to close Pro and reopen because it's got to rehydrate. And I really need to stop and restart my service. I've just changed the service definition behind the scenes, right? So let me do that real quick. We'll save that. We'll jump over to my services. I'll stop my Naperville service and restart it. And fire back up Pro. All right, and now without any other configuration, I'll just show you real quick how you can see that diagram template is available. If I were to try to generate a diagram with it right now, it wouldn't be very exciting. It's just going to be exactly what we had in the geographic data. I haven't done any real configuration to it. So what I'm going to show you real quick is how we would do the configuration to just remove some things from the network. We'll simplify down that initial diagram that we had. So to do that, I'm going to actually switch over and do the rest of this with a model. And the nice thing, if you do it in a model, it's repeatable. So oftentimes our customers, you guys if you are our customers, they have multiple environments. They have a test, they have a staging, they have a production. So I build this model, and once I'm happy with it, now I just point it to the next environment and hit run again, right? It makes it so easy to make sure I have the exact same configuration if I do this from a model. So I'm going to alter my diagram template. I need to tell it which utility network I'm dealing with in case I happen to have multiple. I need to tell it which diagram template, and now you can see, sure enough, Dev Summit is an option. I'm going to tell it, when I rerun this, I want it to wipe out everything it had before and reapply whatever's in the model. Otherwise, it's additive. Anything you do just keeps kind of appending to the end, so you've got to be really careful. If you want to run clean, just click that, it'll clean it out, and it'll reapply everything. I'm also going to tell it that when I have containers, I would like to set a margin around the contents of 2 meters in this case, and I'm going to enable some capabilities on here. Next thing that I want to do is tell it that I want it to deal with connectivity associations. So for those of you that are familiar with the UN, a lot of times we have connectivity associations. Those are not visible in the map. So remember, your user can't select it. So when they select data and generate a diagram, you'll have these weird gaps because those features weren't there. So you apply this rule. And what that does is saying, hey, whatever the user selected, we're behind the scenes going to go check. If there's connectivity associations for those features, we'll automatically add them to the diagram so you don't have those weird gaps. Very important one. If you're going to do any configuration, you're probably going to want to do this. So I'm going to connect up my template. This one's pretty simple. Really, now it just comes down to what are you trying to do? I'm going to remove some stuff from the network. Let's add a remove junction. Let's see, I want to add a junction, a reduced junction by attribute. So what I'm going to do with this particular one is I want to get rid of all features from, let's see, what do I want to do? We'll get rid of everything from the device class unless it is a circuit breaker, a transformer, or a switch. So essentially we'll get rid of the fuses that we saw before. So we go into this configuration of this rule. The class that I'm going to be playing with is the device class. And I'm going to set up and say, hey, reduce the features if their asset group does not include the value of circuit breaker, switch, or transformer. Okay? And we've got lots of constraints, so get rid of them if they're orphans, if they're single, or if they're only in 2 connection locations. Get rid of those things. And then I'm going to add another junction reduction rule without needing any attributes this time to get rid of things in the junction class. In my case, I don't care about the things in the junction class. So I don't need to specify any filters. I'm just going to point it to the distribution junction and set those same constraints. So let's clean up the layout, fit it to the window. So now if I generated a diagram, it's going to try to reduce everything except those transformer circuit breakers and switches. But the last thing I'm going to do real quick is I want to automatically apply a layout. So I'm going to add a set root junction. So I want, just like you saw me do manually, I know that I want the user to always have the circuit breaker at the top. So I'm going to go in on this root and say, hey, when the user generates a diagram, if you find a circuit breaker, I want that to be the root of the layout algorithm. So if the asset group is equal to circuit breaker, choose that as the root. And then the final thing I'm going to do is add the smart tree. So we'll drop the smart tree tool on here, connect this up, and set some properties. Is the same thing you saw me do in the GP tool as an end user. I'm going to go from top to bottom, and I want to square those edges, orthogonal. So let's clean this up. That's my diagram template, okay? So I'll validate this, I'll run this. It's usually, you know, less than a minute. Something small like this will run fairly fast. But this is doing a lot, this behind the scenes, especially for those of you that learned that old schematics configuration tool. You can see how much easier this is immediately. Okay, so that's done. Just to be safe, I'm going to restart the service. I don't need to stop and restart Pro this time though, because the only thing Pro knows about is the template name. It's already there, so I don't need to stop it. But my service is behind the scenes. It's a good idea in case the socks have anything cached, sorry, not crashed. We never crash. In case there's caching, it's good to restart that. So I'm restarted. Go back over to my map. Hopefully I still have my select. No, I do not have my selection, so let's rerun that trace real quick. Oh yeah, I don't have the selection because I showed you the jumping back and forth, picking up, propagating the selection back and forth from the map. So we'll rerun this. It still should have my starting points and barriers. Yep, same 21 features. We'll go in and hit Dev Summit now. And hopefully, if I did that correctly, my end result is a top-down smart tree, squared lines, where we have done a bunch of reduction. But now what I notice I forgot to show you is by default, this just falls back to default symbology. So I don't have the pretty symbology that you saw before. So it is another very important thing to remember to import symbology. And you need to do that from the client-server connection. You just import that symbology, and then that's stored in the template. So now anytime somebody generates the diagram, it'll reuse that symbology, that labeling configuration automatically, plus do all of this stuff for you. Sorry, that was a whirlwind way in to just show you a little bit about what an end user does with diagrams, what an admin needs to do to configure very specific focused types of diagrams. Hope you learned something. We will have another deeper meeting about utility network later this afternoon. You can catch me after this if you've got more questions. Thanks.